Welcome to this session of literary criticism, where we would be looking into some other aspects of the essay, the function of criticism. In the critical essays like The Perfect Critic, The Imperfect Critic, The Function of Criticism and The Frontiers of Criticism, Eliot discusses the qualifications and functions of a critic. An understanding of these aspects would reveal the intensity with which Eliot carries out criticism. We begin with the qualifications of an ideal critic according to Eliot. He says a critic must possess a developed sense of tradition. The critic must have knowledge of literature of his own country as well as the literature of Europe down from Homer to the contemporary period. A good critic must be entirely impersonal and objective. He must be guided by some authority outside himself and not the inner voice. Eliot gives examples of Arthur Symons, who is subjective and impressionistic, and Matthew Arnold, who is dry and intellectual with his criticism. Eliot regards Aristotle as an example of a perfect critic who avoids both these defects. Under the influence of Eliot, criticism becomes a scientific exercise. A critic must be unemotional and objective in his pronouncements. He must try to discipline his personal prejudices and whims. This is possible only if he has a trained sensibility guided by certain principles. A critic must not be satisfied with vague emotional impressions. Such criticism would lead to corruption of taste. An ideal critic must have a heightened sense of fact. The knowledge of the technical details of a poem, such as its genesis and setting. It is a knowledge of facts that can make criticism concrete as well as objective. It is these facts which a critic must use to appreciate a work of art. However, Eliot is against the lemon squeezer school of critics who try to squeeze every drop of meaning out of words and lines. Poets, says Eliot, make the best critics. The critic and the creative artist should frequently be the same person, says Eliot. Such poet critics would have a thorough knowledge and understanding of the process of poetic creation. An ideal critic must have a thorough understanding of the language and structure of a poem. He must also have an idea of the music of poetry, for the poet communicates through words and sound. Comparison and analysis are the chief tools of a critic. A perfect critic must be an expert in the use of these tools. His use of these tools must be subtle and skillful. He must know the art of making comparisons and evaluation. He must compare the writers of the present with those of the past without using similar standards of judgment. The duty of a critic is not to pass judgment or determine good or bad, but to elucidate the qualities of a work under criticism. In other words, the critic must be a man of erudition so that he can use his tools effectively. A critic must not try to judge the present by the standards of the past. The requirements of each age are different, and so the principles of art change from one period to the other. The critic must be liberal in his outlook. He must be prepared to correct or revise his views in the light of new facts. Eliot goes on to tell us about the functions of a critic, and he believes that the primary function of a critic is to elucidate works of art. This function can be performed by using the tools of comparison and analysis. The role of a critic is not to interpret works of art. Interpretation could become subjective and an impressionistic exercise. In Eliot's words, analysis and comparison, catholicity and sensitiveness, intelligence, curiosity, intensity of passion, infinite knowledge are necessary to become a great critic. The critic must be able to correct the taste of the readers. He must enable them to sift the worthy from insignificant details. He must develop his readers to inculcate the qualities of discrimination and forethought. A critic must promote enjoyment and understanding of works of art. He must develop both the aesthetic and the intellectual sensibilities of his readers. It is the function of a critic to turn the attention from the poet to his poetry. The emotion of art is impersonal, distinct from the emotion of the poet. The poem is a thing in itself, and it must be judged objectively without any biographical, sociological or historical considerations. Relevant facts about the poem should be placed before the readers. Criticism must aid creation. Criticism is of great importance to creativity. The poet creates, but the critic in him sifts, combines, corrects and expunges to perfectly finish what he has created. No great work of art is possible without critical labor. The function of a critic is to find common goals in the pursuit of criticism. He must cooperate with the critics of the past and the present. He must also realize that all truths are tentative and so must be ready to correct and modify his views as fresh facts come to light. The function of a critic is not to pass judgment or to determine good or bad. His function is to place similar kinds of facts before the readers and thus help them to form their own judgment. A critic must ensure the active participation of the readers in the work of criticism. Criticism is concerned with the nature and function of poetry and the poetic process. Criticism deals with the evaluation of works of art. With this end in view, the critic should bring the lessons of the past to assist the present. Let us now analyze or estimate Eliot as a critic. Eliot is one of the most famous poetic critics alongside Ben Jonson, Dryden, Dr. Samuel Johnson, Wordsworth, Coleridge and Arnold. He has published around 500 essays and most of them have influenced literary criticism. In this connection, George Watson comments, Eliot made English criticism look different, though not in a simple sense. The Sacred Wood, which contains some of his significant essays, has made a positive and far-reaching impact on the art of criticism. F.R. Leavis' early books on the English poetic tradition shows the influence of T.S. Eliot. In New Bearings in English Poetry, published in 1932, he dismisses the praise accorded to the Victorian and Georgian poets. He follows Eliot in finding the metaphysical poets the qualities needed in modern poetry. Eliot's criticism is considered to be a reaction against certain prevalent views or the reassessment of writers and their works of art that would necessarily challenge status quo and redefine canonical tradition. His practical criticism helped to revive the metaphysical school of poetry. Likewise, Dryden and other Augustan poets reclaimed their position due to Eliot's assessment. Eliot asserts that the objective of criticism is to bring about a readjustment between the old and the new, and his criticism is proof of his methods. To quote Eliot, "From time to time it is desirable that some critic shall appear to review the past of our literature and set the poets and the poems in a new order." Unquote. It is difficult to find critics who possess an unusual capacity for judgment and the independence of mind to recognize and interpret the past writers. Eliot's theoretical criticism is a reaction against the excesses of Romantic and Victorian criticism. Influenced by T. E. Hume, he revived classical art and criticism. He rejected the Romantic view of the perfect individual and stressed on the doctrine of original sin. He exposed the futility of the Romantic faith in the inner voice, which he considered to be merely doing what one desires to do. Eliot emphasized that a critic must follow objective standards rather than his inner voice. A critic, says Eliot, must conform to tradition. The essay "Tradition and the Individual Talent" expresses the view that respect for author and authority would benefit the writer. His criticism is a corrective to the eccentricity and waywardness of the impressionistic school of criticism. He also denounces the abstract and intellectual school of criticism represented by Arnold. A. G. George comments, "Eliot's theory of the impersonality of poetry is the greatest theory on the nature of the poetic process after Wordsworth's romantic conception of poetry." Unquote. Eliot rejects romantic subjectivism and proposes the revolutionary statement that poetry is not a letting loose of emotion but an escape from emotion. Poetry is not an expression of personality but an escape from personality. The mind of the poet acts like a catalytic agent in which diverse emotions combine to form new products. The emotions of a poet are different from artistic emotion, and therefore the function of criticism should focus on poetry rather than the poet. Eliot's views on the nature of poetic process are relevant. Poetry for Eliot is organization where the poet's mind functions as a receptacle that stores feelings, emotions and experiences. The poetic process involves the combination of these diverse experiences and emotions. In his essay, "The Metaphysical Poets," he discusses about two important terms: dissociation of sensibility and unification of sensibility. The emotional and the intellectual, the creative and the critical faculties must work in harmony to produce a great work of art. A great poet delights and instructs. For Eliot, the greatness of a poem is assessed by the order and unity it imposes on the chaotic and diverse experiences of the poet. The pleasure imparted by a poem or the moral elevation it leads to is insignificant. Eliot's influence on his successors has been phenomenal. Eliot has succeeded in correcting and educating the taste of his readers, and he has brought about a re-evaluation of the function of poetry and the nature of poetic process. John Hayward mentions, "No critic indeed since Coleridge has shown more clearly the use of poetry and criticism." Unquote. Eliot's views on historical processes, his adherence to tradition, elucidation of the functions of a critic, and the manner in which criticism has to be done reveals a poet critic who is objective, scientific, and genuine in his pronouncements. Eliot does not impose his views on the readers. His style of writing, which is lucid and sharp, arrests the attention of the readers. Of course, there is no critic without any limitations. Let us find out some of the limitations of Eliot's critical methods. Eliot has often been accused of being snobbish, maintaining an overbearing attitude. Instead of being sympathetic in critical assessment, he resorts to uncompromising judgment. His criticism is often colored by personal and religious prejudices. Dislike of others has often interfered with his honest and impartial estimate. In this aspect, Eliot does not follow his theory of objectivity and impersonality of poetry. His condemnation of Milton and Shelley does not agree with his principles. He does not judge all writers by the same standards of criticism. An element of didacticism intrudes in his later essays. Some critics have noticed a dogmatic critical stance in Eliot. Though F.R. Lewis followed Eliot's principles for some time, he repeatedly attacked Eliot's criticism, especially the theory of impersonality proposed in the essay Tradition and the Individual Talent. However, it has to be agreed that in spite of these drawbacks, Eliot continues to inspire younger generations, and his critical essays are widely read in academic circles. Let us now have a short recap of what we have done so far this session. Eliot's reputation as a leading poet critic of the 20th century is incomparable. He has made a positive contribution to the art of criticism. He says that people who do not care for literary inheritance could become barbaric, and the people who cease to produce literature were to turn out to be deficient in thought and sensibility. In his theoretical criticism, Eliot expresses his views against the impressionistic critics. He emphasizes the need for objectivity and scientific temperament to the study of literature. His prose style is marked by lucidity, use of appropriate phrases and quotations. Eliot is admired by many eminent critics for his genuine comments, sensible views and proper judgments. He analyzes the works of specific writers with clarity. Eliot has influenced writers like F.R. Lewis, and his criticism is considered to be the principal force behind the advent of new criticism. Eliot has rightly been recognized as one of the most influential critics of modern criticism. All this being said, we have questions for you that would help you to understand Eliot and his methods better. Until we meet next time with further sessions on literary criticism, thank you.